Nobody remembers the car that kept pace with the Jaguars. That's the thing about Le Mans. Everyone remembers the winners. The C-types screaming down the Mulsanne Straight. The D-types, with their shark fin stabilizers cutting through the night air. The factory teams, the works drivers, the champagne. What nobody tells you is what was happening just behind them, a grey saloon, elegant and completely out of place, holding its own against machines built for exactly this kind of brutality. That car was the Alvis TC21, over 100, and most people have never heard of it. Here's what makes this story different. This wasn't a race car pretending to be a road car. It was the opposite. A proper British gentleman's saloon, the kind of car a retired general or a decorated war pilot would drive to the countryside on a Sunday, built on a chassis that traced its roots back to before the Second World War. Wooden floorboards, separate frame, everything the modern racing world had already moved past. And yet, there it was. Before we get to the track, you need to understand what Alvis actually was, because if you think this is just a story about a forgotten car, you're about to be surprised. Alvis was founded in Coventry in 1919. From the very beginning, they did things nobody else was doing. One of the first British front-wheel drive production cars. Independent front suspension in the 1930s, when most of the industry was still catching up. A 6-cylinder engine refined to a standard that made Rolls-Royce buyers look twice. This was not a small, irrelevant company. At its peak, Alvis employed around 2,400 people and had a factory covering 29 acres in Coventry, the undisputed motor city of Britain. Their customers weren't random. Douglas Bader, the Royal Air Force ace, who lost both legs in a pre-war crash and still flew Spitfires in combat, drove an Alvis. The composer Bernard Herrmann, who scored every Hitchcock film you've ever watched, was a devoted Alvis man. Singer Carmen Miranda. These were people who knew what they wanted and refused to compromise on quality. So when Alvis decided to build something faster, something sharper, something that could hit 100 miles per hour straight from the showroom floor, they didn't shout about it. They just did it. And they called her the Grey Lady. The name came from a moment at the 1953 Earl's Court Motor Show in London. The sales manager walked in, saw the new car on display painted grey, with grey leather inside, and the name simply arrived, Grey Lady. It stuck immediately. And the car beneath that quiet, understated exterior was anything but quiet. But here's the part that almost nobody talks about. One of the engineers working at Alvis between 1952 and 1955 was a man named Alec Isagonis. You might know him from something else he built later, a small, revolutionary car called the Mini. At Alvis, Isagonis was designing a V8 engine for a completely new model. A car that could have changed everything for the brand. It never made it to production. Too expensive. Too ambitious. The project was shelved. And the Grey Lady was left to carry the whole weight of what Alvis could do alone. Let's talk about what the Grey Lady actually was under that polished exterior, because the numbers tell a story that the marketing never fully captured. The TC21 over 100 ran a 3-liter straight-six engine, twin SU carburetors. Compression ratio pushed up to 8.2 to 1, a meaningful jump over the standard TC21's 7.2. The result was 100 brake horsepower and a verified top speed of just over 100 miles per hour. That's where the name came from. TC21/100, 100 horsepower. 100 miles per hour. Clean, precise, no exaggeration. A road test by the Motor Magazine in 1954 confirmed it. 100.1 miles per hour, flat out. 0 to 60 in 15.4 seconds. Those numbers don't sound dramatic today. In 1954, they were extraordinary. Very few standard production cars anywhere in the world could do what this saloon did straight off the showroom floor. The exterior told you almost nothing. That was deliberate. The Grey Lady wore twin air scoops on the bonnet, functional, not decorative, helping feed the engine and reduce underbonnet heat. Center-lock Dunlop wire wheels, side louvres, chrome door frames with hidden hinges on the later models. subtle details that rewarded attention. To anyone who didn't know, it looked like a refined, conservative British saloon. To anyone who did know, it was something else entirely. Inside, the picture completed itself. Leather upholstery, walnut dashboard facings, pile carpets, separately adjustable front seats. A heater and air conditioning unit as standard at a time when most cars offered neither. The instruments sat in the center of the dashboard, unusual, slightly impractical if your left hand happened to mask the speedometer, but deeply considered in every other way. This was a car built for someone who drove themselves, took pride in doing so, and expected the machine to meet them at their level. The chassis, though that's where the story gets complicated. The Grey Lady's foundations went back to the pre-war 12/70, separate frame, wooden boarded floor, independent front suspension with coil springs, leaf springs at the rear. It was, in the language of modern motorsport, ancient. The kind of architecture that serious racing engineers in 1953 had already abandoned in favor of lighter, stiffer monocoque construction, unitary bodies, welded shells. The future. Alvis was building the past, beautifully, but the past, nonetheless. And here is the contradiction that sits at the heart of this entire story. A car with a pre-war skeleton, a modest 3-liter engine, and a body designed for gentlemen was about to prove, repeatedly, that it could humiliate machinery built by people who thought they knew exactly what a fast car should look like. The reason comes down to something that never appears in the spec sheet. The Grey Lady had balance, real balance. The kind that comes from engineers who understood weight distribution, suspension geometry, and steering feel as principles rather than targets. Contemporary road testers noted that the understeer was minimal and easily corrected, that the steering loaded up cleanly, through corners, without going heavy or vague, that the car felt, in the precise words of one review, tidy and biddable, not a word you see in racing press, but exactly the right word. On a twisting road, in the right hands, the Grey Lady didn't just keep up, she made it look easy. And nobody was paying attention. Yet, here is something the history books tend to skip past. Alvis had been racing since almost the beginning, not casually, seriously. In 1923, the same year the 24 Hours of Le Mans was first held, Alvis was already building a reputation at Brooklands, the banked oval circuit in Surrey, where British speed records lived and died. Major C.M. Harvey, an Alvis Works driver, won races there that year. The 12/50 Alvis's signature vintage sports car became one of the most celebrated competition cars of its era in Britain, not because of factory investment, but because the machine itself invited you to push it. By 1928, Alvis was at Le Mans. A modified car ran in the top 4 during that race before a cracked sump ended the effort. 4th place, at Le Mans, in 1928. Against the full field of international competition, that result alone should have written Alvis permanently into the story of the circuit. It didn't. Because Alvis never came back with the kind of factory assault that generates headlines and monuments. They kept winning quietly. A speed record here, a class victory there. The kind of racing that the sports historians file under notable and promptly forget about when the next Bentley or Jaguar story needs telling. By the early 1950s, Alvis had officially withdrawn from factory racing. The decision was practical. The company needed to sell cars, not fund campaigns at circuits where the competition budget of a single Jaguar Works entry could dwarf an entire Alvis annual program. But the cars kept racing anyway, privately, in the hands of owners who understood what they had. And then came Goodwood. The Goodwood revival is not a modern invention, but the spirit it captures the idea of bringing the machinery of the 1950s back onto a proper circuit, against proper competition, watched by people who actually understand what they're seeing. That spirit is exactly the context the Grey Lady needed. Ivan Dutton was a Bugatti specialist. He knew old cars. He knew what good engineering felt like beneath his hands. He wasn't looking for an Alvis when he found one. He was at a local village fete, there to display a Bugatti, when he saw a woman pulling a Grey Lady behind her Range Rover. The car had been in her family since 1964. Her husband had died. She didn't want to sell it, but circumstances had changed. Dutton handed over £800. What he found when he got it back to his workshop was sobering. The wooden floor was completely rotten. The chassis, though the chassis was solid, pre-war architecture, yes. But the bones were good. Dutton extended the chassis sides, fabricated 4 outriggers to properly mount the body, installed a roll cage, and rebuilt the mechanical package with the kind of obsessive care that Bugatti restoration teaches you. He wasn't trying to make it something it wasn't. He was trying to find out what it actually was. The answer came at the Goodwood Revival, in the St. Mary's Trophy, a race for significant saloon cars of the pre-1959 era. The Grey Lady lined up against Jaguars, against cars with modern monocoque construction, against machinery that looked, on paper, significantly faster and more advanced. Jerry Marshall drove the first heat, second place. Then Dutton himself took the wheel for Heat 2, fourth, third overall, on combined results, in the car's first ever competitive outing. The Octane magazine journalist who tested her at Silverstone afterwards used words that don't usually appear in track reports: predictable, forgiving, comfortable, and then almost reluctantly, indecently quick. The tail would step out, you'd lift off, and she'd gather herself back, composed, as if nothing had happened. That predictability, that absolute trust between driver and machine was the secret. Not horsepower, not aerodynamics. Trust. Now here's the part that should make you genuinely angry. In 1953, the same year the Grey Lady debuted at Earl's Court, Alvis was sitting on something that could have completely changed their future. Alec Isagonis, the engineer who would go on to design the Mini, one of the most influential cars in automotive history, was working in Coventry at Alvis, drawing plans for an all-new model. A car with a V8 engine, modern, ambitious, the kind of project that, if it had reached production, would have given Alvis the weapon it needed to compete directly with Jaguar at every level. The project was cancelled. Too expensive to develop, too expensive to tool up for production. The accountants looked at the numbers, and the numbers didn't work. Isagonis left. The V8 died on the drawing board. And Alvis was left with the Grey Lady, a brilliant car built on a foundation that was already 20 years old as its highest performance offering. Think about what that means for a moment. The man who later created a vehicle that sold over 5 million units, that redefined what a small car could be, that influenced every front-wheel drive hatchback built in the 50 years that followed, that man was at Alvis, with resources, with a brief, with a vision. And the timing simply wasn't right. The money wasn't there. The will wasn't sufficient. History is full of these moments, the thing that could have happened and didn't, the pivot that never came. Meanwhile, Jaguar was doing the opposite. The C-Type won Le Mans in 1951 and 1953. The D-Type arrived in 1954 with its aircraft-influenced monocoque structure and a 3.4-liter engine, producing over 250 horsepower. Jaguar wasn't just racing, they were building the future of the brand with every lap. Every victory was a sales catalogue. Every finish line was an advertisement. The 1954 Le Mans was a war between Ferrari's brute 512 force and Jaguar's precision engineering. The Ferrari 375 Plus won by less than half a lap after 24 hours. The Jaguar D-Types were right there. The whole world was watching. Nobody was watching the Alvis. And yet, in the background, something was happening that the race reports never captured. Private owners were running Alvis machinery in the supporting categories and smaller events that surrounded the major circuits, quietly doing what the factory wouldn't or couldn't do officially, demonstrating, lap after lap, that the car had genuine pace if you were willing to find it. The Grey Lady's problem was never performance. The suspension geometry that made her so balanced on a country road made her equally composed on a circuit. The engine that pulled cleanly from low revs in traffic pulled just as cleanly through a long corner at racing speed. The brakes that impressed road testers impressed track testers too. The problem was visibility. In a world being reshaped by factory racing programs with budgets, press offices, and purpose-built machinery, A gentleman's saloon from a small Coventry manufacturer with a pre-war chassis simply didn't generate the kind of attention that translates into legend. You have to be loud to become famous. Alvis was constitutionally incapable of being loud. If you're finding this story as fascinating as I do, and I think you are, because you're still here, go ahead and leave a comment below. Tell me which forgotten car you think deserves its own video. Drop a like if this is the kind of deep dive you want more of. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now, because the cars we cover here are exactly the ones that history tried to bury, and we're not letting that happen. By 1955, it was over. Not with a bang, with a paperwork problem. The Grey Lady's body was built by Mulliners of Birmingham, a coach builder with a long relationship with Alvis, responsible for the saloon bodies on the TA21 and TC21 range throughout the early 1950s. Mulliners was good, reliable, understood the Alvis standard, and then, quietly, the business changed hands. Mulliners became part of Standard Triumph. Shortly after, it was absorbed again, this time into Aston Martin Lagonda. Alvis suddenly had no coach builder. 727 TC21s and TC21 over 100s had been built in total between 1950 and 1955. Of those, only 100 were drophead coupes, all to the Grey Lady specification. The production run ended not because the car was obsolete, not because customers stopped wanting it, but because the industrial supply chain that made it possible had been dismantled by the gravitational pull of larger manufacturers eating smaller ones. This is the hidden cost of being a specialist. You depend on specialists, and specialists are always vulnerable. Alvis tried to adapt. They turned to Hermann Graeber, a Swiss coach builder whose work on the Alvis 3-liter chassis had been drawing admiring crowds at Geneva motor shows since 1951. Graeber's designs were beautiful, genuinely beautiful, but the transition was slow, expensive, and produced only tiny numbers during the years between 1955 and 1958. Around 15 or 16 TC108 G models were built by Willowbrook of Loughborough. Graeber himself built 22 more. He complained, with some justification, that if he had received more chassis, he could have committed to 20 cars per year. The chassis weren't coming fast enough. The 1958 TD21 finally stabilized things. Park Ward, the coach builder for Rolls-Royce and Bentley, took on the contract. Production resumed at something closer to a normal rate. But the momentum that the TC21 over 100 had built, the reputation, the quiet confidence of a car that could genuinely compete with the established names that had been broken by 3 years of near silence. Customers who might have waited looked elsewhere. The market had moved. Jaguar was offering the XK140, then the XK150 faster, better publicized, and despite costing less than an Alvis, somehow carrying more social cachet because of Le Mans. The equation that had always worked in Alvis's favor, quality, discretion, real driver engagement, was being undermined by the growing power of brand image over substance. Alvis was not a brand, it was a standard. And in the 1950s, the market was beginning to prefer brands. By 1965, Rover took a controlling interest. British Leyland followed. A mid-engined V8, prototype the Rover P6BS, was rumored to be the new Alvis. It was shelved. The TF21 launched in 1966, the fastest Alvis ever built at 127 miles per hour, and sold 109 units before production ceased in 1967. 48 years of car manufacturing ended. What remained was transferred to a company called Red Triangle, founded by former Alvis employees who refused to let the knowledge disappear. They inherited 22,000 car records, over 50,000 technical drawings, the complete stock of parts, everything needed to keep the surviving cars alive. It wasn't a resurrection, but it was a refusal to accept erasure. The Grey Lady didn't disappear. She just became invisible to the people writing the headlines. Here is what the story of the Alvis TC21 over 100 actually teaches you, if you're willing to sit with it for a moment. The Grey Lady was not a car that failed. She was a car that existed in the wrong commercial conditions at the right mechanical moment. The engineering was sound. The balance was exceptional. The performance was real and independently verified. On the track at Goodwood, against Jaguars with every structural and technological advantage, she finished third overall on her first appearance. In Silverstone testing, professional journalists ran out of superlatives for how she felt at the limit. None of that was enough, because performance, without visibility, disappears. Jaguar understood something that Alvis didn't or couldn't afford to understand. Racing at the highest level isn't only about proving what your car can do, it's about making sure the world sees it. The C-Type and D-Type victories at Le Mans didn't just win races, they constructed a mythology. They gave every XK 140 buyer a story to tell at dinner. They turned a car company into a cultural symbol. Alvis won quietly, raced privately, built cars with souls that rewarded the driver who paid attention. And because the world wasn't paying attention, the world moved on without them. The people who drove Alvis Cars knew. Douglas Bader knew. Bernard Herrmann knew. The drivers, who lined up against Jaguars at Goodwood and found a grey saloon keeping pace with them, they knew. But knowing isn't the same as being remembered. This is the uncomfortable truth that the Grey Lady's story leaves you with. Excellence, without an audience, is invisible. The car that kept up with the Jaguars at Le Mans disappeared without a headline, not because it wasn't good enough, but because nobody was telling its story loudly enough, consistently enough, for long enough. We're telling it now, a little late, but better late than never. If this video did something for you, if it made you think about a car, a brand, or even an idea that deserved more than it got, leave a comment. I genuinely read them, and your suggestions shape what we cover next. This channel exists for exactly these stories. The ones that fell through the cracks of automotive history because they didn't come with a factory press release or a podium photograph. Like this video, if the Grey Lady earned it. Subscribe if you want to be here when we find the next one, because there are more of them than you think, and every single one has a story worth telling. The Grey Lady kept her composure to the end. The least we can do is remember her name,